Sarah Martinez pulled her old Honda into the parking spot outside the county courthouse, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the engine. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete steps leading to the imposing building, where she would face her first court appearance. At 28, she had never imagined she would find herself in this situation. But life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges when you least expected them. The traffic violation that brought her here seemed minor compared to the chaos that had consumed her life over the past 6 months. After losing her job as a social worker due to budget cuts, Sarah had been struggling to make ends meet. The unpaid parking tickets had piled up, and what started as a simple oversight had snowballed into a court summons that she could no longer ignore. She gathered her courage and walked toward the courthouse entrance, joining a line of people waiting to pass through the metal detectors. The security guards looked bored, mechanically checking bags and scanning identification cards with the same routine they had performed thousands of times before. Sarah noticed how they barely glanced at most people, their eyes glazed over with the monotony of their daily tasks. When her turn came, Sarah approached the younger of the two guards, a man in his early 30s with a cocky smile and an attitude that suggested he enjoyed the small amount of power his position gave him. His name tag read Officer Johnson, and he extended his hand expectantly for her identification. Sarah reached into her worn leather purse and pulled out her driver's license, handing it over with a nervous smile. Officer Johnson took the license and walked over to his computer terminal, his partner following close behind. Sarah watched as they input her information into their system, their casual conversation audible from where she stood. They were discussing weekend plans and complaining about their supervisor, treating her presence as nothing more than another routine interruption to their day. "Let's see what we've got here," Johnson muttered, typing Sarah's information into the database. The screen flickered as it processed the request, and both officers leaned in to read the results. Their casual demeanor shifted slightly as they scanned through the basic information that appeared on their monitors. Sarah's record showed the expected traffic violations and unpaid fines, nothing that would typically raise eyebrows in a place like this. The officers chuckled among themselves, making comments about another person who couldn't manage to pay their tickets on time. Their smirks widened as they prepared to hand back her license, ready to send her through to join the crowd of other minor offenders waiting for their turn before the judge. But something unexpected happened as the system continued to process her information. A small notification appeared in the corner of the screen, indicating that additional data was being retrieved from a secondary database. This was unusual, as most routine traffic stops and court appearances only accessed basic driver and criminal history information. The officers initially didn't notice the small loading indicator, continuing their conversation about how people like Sarah were just taking up space in their courthouse. Johnson picked up her license, preparing to hand it back, when his partner noticed something strange happening on the computer screen. The display had changed, showing that classified information was being accessed from a federal database. "Hold on, Officer Martinez," the older guard said quietly, grabbing his partner's arm before he could return Sarah's identification. "Look at this." He pointed to the screen where new information was beginning to populate. Information that required special clearance to access and was protected by multiple layers of security. Johnson's expression changed from boredom to confusion as he read the classification level appearing on their monitor. This wasn't the typical information they saw when processing visitors to the courthouse. The system was indicating that Sarah's identity was connected to files that were far above their security clearance level, files that contained information they weren't authorized to view. Sarah stood waiting, unaware of the drama unfolding at the security station. She checked her watch, worried about being late for her scheduled court appearance. The other people in line behind her were beginning to show signs of impatience, shifting their weight and checking their phones as the delay stretched longer than usual. The two officers huddled around their computer screen, speaking in hushed tones as they tried to understand what they were seeing. The system had flagged Sarah's identity for reasons they couldn't comprehend, and protocol dictated that they needed to investigate further before allowing her to proceed into the courthouse. "Officer," Johnson felt his earlier confidence evaporating as he realized they were dealing with something far beyond a simple traffic court appearance. The woman standing before them, who looked like any other struggling citizen dealing with minor legal troubles, apparently had connections to classified government operations that were completely outside their area of expertise. Sarah began to sense that something was wrong when she noticed the officers' body language change. Their casual chatter had stopped, and they were now speaking in serious, quiet tones, while looking back and forth between her and their computer screen. She wondered if there was some kind of technical problem with their system, or if perhaps there was an issue with her identification that she wasn't aware of. The morning crowd continued to grow behind Sarah as more people arrived for their various court appointments. The delay was creating a bottleneck at the security checkpoint, and the guards were beginning to feel pressure to resolve whatever issue was causing the holdup. But neither of them wanted to make a mistake when dealing with classified information that they didn't understand. Officer Martinez reached for his radio, preparing to call his supervisor for guidance on how to handle the situation. The classification codes appearing on their screen indicated that Sarah's identity was connected to federal operations that were far above the level of local courthouse security. Whatever was hidden in those classified files, it was serious enough to trigger automatic security protocols that neither guard had encountered before in their years of routine courthouse duty. Sarah's anxiety began to increase as she watched the officers' increasingly serious expressions and their obvious reluctance to return her identification. She wondered if there was some kind of warrant or legal issue she wasn't aware of, or if perhaps her identity had been mixed up with someone else's in their computer system. The possibility that her simple court appearance was about to become much more complicated sent a chill down her spine as she waited for the officers to explain what was happening. Officer Martinez's radio crackled to life as he called for his supervisor, Sergeant Williams, to come to the security checkpoint immediately. The urgency in his voice was enough to get Williams's attention, even though the sergeant was in the middle of reviewing daily schedules with the courthouse administration. Within minutes, Williams appeared at the security station, his expression serious as he approached the two guards who were clearly out of their depth. "What's the situation?" Williams asked, his eyes moving between the officers and Sarah, who was still standing patiently at the checkpoint. The line behind her had grown considerably, and other visitors were beginning to voice their complaints about the delay. Williams could see that whatever was happening needed to be resolved quickly to avoid creating a larger disturbance. Johnson pointed to the computer screen, his voice dropping to a whisper as he explained what they had discovered. "We ran her ID through the system like always, but something weird happened. The computer is showing classification codes we've never seen before. It's trying to access federal databases that are way above our clearance level." Williams moved closer to the monitor, his experienced eyes scanning the information displayed on the screen. As a 20-year veteran of courthouse security, he had seen almost every type of situation that could arise during routine ID checks. But the classification codes appearing on their system were completely foreign to him, indicating levels of security clearance that existed far beyond anything he had encountered in his career. Sarah watched the three officers huddled around their computer, their serious expressions and hushed conversations making her increasingly nervous. She had arrived at the courthouse expecting a simple appearance before a judge to address her traffic violations, but the situation was clearly becoming much more complicated than she had anticipated. The other people in line were growing restless, and she could hear murmurs of complaint from those waiting behind her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment," Sergeant Williams said, approaching Sarah with a professional but cautious demeanor. "There seems to be an issue with our computer system that we need to resolve before we can process your identification. It shouldn't take long, but I need to make some phone calls to figure out what's going on." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she was escorted to a small waiting area near the security checkpoint. The implications of being singled out in this way were not lost on her, and she wondered what could possibly be in her background that would cause such a reaction from the courthouse security team. Her life had been relatively ordinary, with no involvement in anything that should trigger federal security protocols. Williams returned to the computer terminal and began making phone calls to higher authorities, starting with the courthouse administrator and working his way up the chain of command. Each person he spoke with seemed increasingly puzzled by the situation, as none of them had experience dealing with the type of classification codes that had appeared on their system. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in the waiting area, trying to piece together any possible explanation for what was happening. She thought about her background, her education, her work history, and any connections she might have to government operations. As a former social worker, she had clearance to access certain databases related to child welfare and family services, but nothing that should trigger federal security alerts. The courthouse was beginning to buzz with activity as word spread about the unusual situation at the security checkpoint. Court clerks and administrators were whispering among themselves, speculating about what could cause such a response from the normally routine ID verification process. Even some of the attorneys waiting for their cases to be called were taking notice of the commotion. Officer Johnson remained at his post, continuing to monitor the computer screen as additional information slowly populated from the federal databases. The system was clearly struggling to process whatever classified information was associated with Sarah's identity, with loading screens and security warnings appearing regularly on the monitor. After nearly an hour of phone calls and consultations, Sergeant Williams received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but authoritative, belonging to someone with the clearance level necessary to understand what was happening with Sarah's identification. Williams listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions as the situation was explained to him. "I need to speak with Ms. Martinez immediately," Williams said after ending his phone call. His demeanor had shifted from confusion to something approaching respect, though he was clearly still processing whatever information he had just received. He approached Sarah with a completely different attitude than he had shown earlier. "Ms. Martinez, I apologize for the delay and any inconvenience this has caused," Williams said, his tone now formal and respectful. "I've been in contact with federal authorities who have explained the situation to me. Without going into details that I'm not authorized to discuss, I can tell you that your identification has triggered security protocols that are far above our normal operations here at the courthouse." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as Williams spoke. While it seemed that she wasn't in trouble, the implications of having federal authorities involved in what should have been a simple court appearance were deeply concerning. She wondered what aspects of her life or background could possibly warrant this level of attention from government agencies. "What does this mean for my court appearance today?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I came here to address my traffic violations, and I don't understand why that would involve federal authorities or classified databases." Williams glanced back at his computer screen, where new information was still appearing. As the federal databases continued to process Sarah's identification, the classification codes were becoming more specific, indicating that her identity was connected to operations that were not only classified, but also currently active, meaning that whatever she was involved in was ongoing rather than historical. "I'm afraid I can't answer most of your questions," Williams replied carefully. "What I can tell you is that your court appearance today is going to be postponed while this matter is resolved. You're not in any trouble, but there are protocols that need to be followed when these types of security flags appear in our system." Sarah felt a sinking sensation in her stomach as she realized that her simple traffic court case had somehow become entangled with federal security matters that she didn't understand. The other visitors to the courthouse were still waiting in line, their impatience growing as the delay continued. But Sarah's situation had clearly moved beyond the scope of normal courthouse operations. The computer screen flickered again, and Officer Johnson called Williams back to the terminal with an urgent expression. Something new had appeared in Sarah's file, something that made all three officers step back from the monitor with expressions of surprise and concern. Whatever information had just populated was significant enough to change their entire approach to the situation. Officer Martinez's radio crackled to life as he called for his supervisor, Sergeant Williams, to come to the security checkpoint immediately. The urgency in his voice was enough to get Williams' attention, even though the sergeant was in the middle of reviewing daily schedules with the courthouse administration. Within minutes, Williams appeared at the security station, his expression serious as he approached the two guards who were clearly out of their depth. "What's the situation?" Williams asked, his eyes moving between the officers and Sarah, who was still standing patiently at the checkpoint. The line behind her had grown considerably, and other visitors were beginning to voice their complaints about the delay. Williams could see that whatever was happening needed to be resolved quickly to avoid creating a larger disturbance. Johnson pointed to the computer screen, his voice dropping to a whisper as he explained what they had discovered. "We ran her ID through the system like always, but something weird happened. The computer is showing classification codes we've never seen before. It's trying to access federal databases that are way above our clearance level. Williams moved closer to the monitor, his experienced eyes scanning the information displayed on the screen. As a 20-year veteran of courthouse security, he had seen almost every type of situation that could arise during routine ID checks. But the classification codes appearing on their system were completely foreign to him, indicating levels of security clearance that existed far beyond anything he had encountered in his career. Sarah watched the three officers huddled around their computer, their serious expressions and hushed conversations making her increasingly nervous. She had arrived at the courthouse expecting a simple appearance before a judge to address her traffic violations. But the situation was clearly becoming much more complicated than she had anticipated. The other people in line were growing restless, and she could hear murmurs of complaint from those waiting behind her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment," Sergeant Williams said, approaching Sarah with a professional but cautious demeanor. "There seems to be an issue with our computer system that we need to resolve before we can process your identification. It shouldn't take long, but I need to make some phone calls to figure out what's going on." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she was escorted to a small waiting area near the security checkpoint. The implications of being singled out in this way were not lost on her, and she wondered what could possibly be in her background that would cause such a reaction from the courthouse security team. Her life had been relatively ordinary, with no involvement in anything that should trigger federal security protocols. Williams returned to the computer terminal and began making phone calls to higher authorities, starting with the courthouse administrator and working his way up the chain of command. Each person he spoke with seemed increasingly puzzled by the situation, as none of them had experience dealing with the type of classification codes that had appeared on their system. Meanwhile, Sarah sat in the waiting area, trying to piece together any possible explanation for what was happening. She thought about her background, her education, her work history, and any connections she might have to government operations. As a former social worker, she had clearance to access certain databases related to child welfare and family services, but nothing that should trigger federal security alerts. The courthouse was beginning to buzz with activity as word spread about the unusual situation at the security checkpoint. Court clerks and administrators were whispering among themselves, speculating about what could cause such a response from the normally routine ID verification process. Even some of the attorneys waiting for their cases to be called were taking notice of the commotion. Officer Johnson remained at his post, continuing to monitor the computer screen as additional information slowly populated from the federal databases. The system was clearly struggling to process whatever classified information was associated with Sarah's identity, with loading screens and security warnings appearing regularly on the monitor. After nearly an hour of phone calls and consultations, Sergeant Williams received a call that changed everything. The voice on the other end of the line was calm but authoritative, belonging to someone with the clearance level necessary to understand what was happening with Sarah's identification. Williams listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions as the situation was explained to him. "I need to speak with Ms. Martinez immediately," Williams said after ending his phone call. His demeanor had shifted from confusion to something approaching respect, though he was clearly still processing whatever information he had just received. He approached Sarah with a completely different attitude than he had shown earlier. "Ms. Martinez, I apologize for the delay and any inconvenience this has caused," Williams said, his tone now formal and respectful. "I've been in contact with federal authorities who have explained the situation to me. Without going into details that I'm not authorized to discuss, I can tell you that your identification has triggered security protocols that are far above our normal operations here at the courthouse." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as Williams spoke. While it seemed that she wasn't in trouble, the implications of having federal authorities involved in what should have been a simple court appearance were deeply concerning. She wondered what aspects of her life or background could possibly warrant this level of attention from government agencies. "What does this mean for my court appearance today?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "I came here to address my traffic violations, and I don't understand why that would involve federal authorities or classified databases." Williams glanced back at his computer screen, where new information was still appearing as the federal databases continued to process Sarah's identification. The classification codes were becoming more specific, indicating that her identity was connected to operations that were not only classified, but also currently active. meaning that whatever she was involved in was ongoing rather than historical. "I'm afraid I can't answer most of your questions," Williams replied carefully. "What I can tell you is that your court appearance today is going to be postponed while this matter is resolved. You're not in any trouble, but there are protocols that need to be. The new information that appeared on the computer screen sent a visible shock through all three officers. A distinctive emblem had materialized in Sarah's file, an emblem that none of them recognized but which clearly carried significant weight in the federal database system. The symbol was accompanied by authorization codes that indicated the highest levels of government clearance, far beyond anything they had encountered in their combined decades of courthouse security work. Sergeant Williams immediately stepped away from the computer and reached for his secure phone line, the one reserved for communications with federal agencies. His hands were slightly unsteady as he dialed a number that had been provided to him during his earlier conversation with federal authorities. The gravity of the situation had escalated far beyond a simple security protocol issue. Sarah watched from her position in the waiting area as the officers' behavior became increasingly formal and deferential. She noticed that they were no longer looking at her with the casual authority of courthouse security guards, but rather with something approaching reverence. This shift in their demeanor was both puzzling and deeply unsettling, as she still had no understanding of what was causing such a dramatic response. The courthouse had begun to take notice of the extended delay at the security checkpoint. Court clerks were peering over from their stations. Attorneys were checking their watches with growing impatience, and even some of the judges had begun to inquire about the disruption to the normal flow of courthouse operations. The situation was drawing attention from every level of the courthouse hierarchy. Within minutes of Williams's phone call, two men in dark suits appeared at the courthouse entrance. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of federal agents, their eyes scanning the area as they approached the security checkpoint. Their arrival seemed to have been anticipated, as Williams immediately moved to greet them with obvious relief at having the situation taken out of his hands. The federal agents introduced themselves quietly to Williams before turning their attention to Sarah. Their approach was professional but respectful, a stark contrast to the casual treatment she had received from the original security guards. It was clear that these men understood the significance of whatever was contained in Sarah's classified file. "Ms. Martinez," the taller of the two agents said, approaching her with his credentials already displayed. "I'm Agent Thompson from the Department of Homeland Security, and this is Agent Rodriguez. We need to speak with you about a matter of national security. I want to assure you that you're not in any trouble, but we do need to discuss some information that has come to our attention." Sarah felt her world tilting as the words national security registered in her mind. Nothing in her background or recent activities should have warranted attention from Homeland Security, and she struggled to understand how her simple court appearance had escalated to this level. Her mouth felt dry as she tried to process the implications of what was happening. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I came here for a traffic court hearing. I have no idea why my identification would trigger any kind of federal security alert. There must be some kind of mistake or mix-up in your databases." Agent Rodriguez stepped forward, his expression sympathetic but serious. "Ms. Martinez, I understand this is confusing and probably frightening. What I can tell you is that your identification has triggered protocols related to a classified operation that you may not even be aware you're connected to. We need to verify some information and ensure that there are no security compromises." The courthouse had effectively come to a standstill as word of the federal agent's arrival spread throughout the building. Court proceedings were being delayed as staff members and attorneys tried to understand what was happening at the security checkpoint. The normal rhythm of legal business had been completely disrupted by the mysterious situation surrounding Sarah's identification. Agent Thompson was reviewing information on a tablet device, cross-referencing details from Sarah's file with other classified databases. The emblem that had appeared in her record was apparently significant enough to warrant immediate federal intervention, but neither agent was willing to explain its meaning or significance to the courthouse security staff. "We're going to need to conduct this conversation in a more secure environment," Agent Thompson announced after finishing his review of the classified information. "Ms. Martinez, we're going to escort you to a federal facility where we can discuss this matter properly. Again, I want to emphasize that you're not under arrest or in any kind of legal trouble." Sarah felt a surge of panic as she realized that her day was about to take an even more dramatic turn. The idea of being taken to a federal facility for questioning about matters she didn't understand was terrifying. but she also recognized that she had little choice in the matter. The classification levels and security protocols that had been triggered were clearly beyond her ability to influence or control. "Can I call someone?" Sarah asked, thinking of her sister Maria, who worked as a paralegal and might be able to provide some guidance or support. "I think I should have some kind of legal representation before we go any further with this." Agent Rodriguez nodded understandingly. "You have every right to contact an attorney, and we encourage you to do so. However, I should mention that this matter involves classified information, so any attorney you choose will need to undergo a security clearance process before they can be fully briefed on the situation." The implications of Agent Rodriguez's statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. If her situation involved classified information to the extent that even her attorney would need security clearance, then whatever she was connected to was far more serious than she had ever imagined. She tried to think of any possible explanation for how her life had become entangled with national security matters. As Sarah made her phone call to her sister, the federal agents conferred quietly with Sergeant Williams about the proper protocols for handling the situation. The courthouse security staff was clearly out of their depth, and the agents were taking steps to ensure that the classified information didn't compromise ongoing federal operations. The emblem in Sarah's file continued to pulse on the computer screen, its significance known only to those with the highest levels of security clearance. Whatever secrets it represented, they were important enough to bring federal agents to a small county courthouse and to completely disrupt the normal course of legal proceedings. Maria answered Sarah's call on the second ring, her cheerful voice turning to concern as Sarah explained the situation as best she could understand it. The conversation was brief and cryptic, as Sarah was acutely aware that federal agents were listening to every word. She managed to convey that she needed legal help and that the situation was far more serious than a simple traffic court appearance. Agent Thompson approached Sarah as she ended her call, his expression professional but not unkind. "Ms. Martinez, we're ready to proceed to our facility. I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand that our primary concern is ensuring national security while protecting your rights and safety. We'll explain everything we can once we're in a secure environment." The federal facility was located in an unmarked building 30 minutes from the courthouse, nestled among a complex of government offices that Sarah had driven past countless times without ever wondering what went on inside. As their black sedan pulled into the underground parking garage, Sarah felt as though she was entering a different world, one that existed parallel to her ordinary life but had remained completely hidden until now. Agent Thompson and Agent Rodriguez escorted Sarah through a series of security checkpoints that made the courthouse screening seem elementary by comparison. Retinal scanners, fingerprint readers, and magnetic card access points marked their path deeper into the building. Each level of security they passed seemed to increase the gravity of whatever situation Sarah had unknowingly become part of. The conference room they finally entered was sparse but comfortable, with no windows and subtle technological features that suggested it was designed for discussing sensitive information. Sarah sat across from the two agents, her nervous energy barely contained as she waited for explanations that she hoped would make sense of the morning's surreal events. "Ms. Martinez," Agent Thompson began, opening a thick folder that contained what appeared to be extensive documentation about her life. "I want to start by asking you about your father, Miguel Martinez. Specifically, I need to know what you remember about his work and his activities during the 1990s. Sarah felt a jolt of surprise at the mention of her father, who had died in a car accident when she was 16 years old. Miguel Martinez had been a loving father, but had always been somewhat secretive about his work, telling his family only that he worked in government consulting and traveled frequently for business reasons that he couldn't discuss in detail. "My father worked for the government in some capacity," Sarah replied carefully, trying to recall details from more than a decade ago. "He traveled a lot, sometimes for weeks at a time, but he never talked about his work at home. My mother always said it was classified, but we assumed it was something routine like immigration services or border security." Agent Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression indicating that Sarah's answer had confirmed something important. "Your father was involved in a highly classified operation during the 1990s, an operation that remains active and sensitive to this day. The emblem that appeared in your file indicates that you are connected to that operation in ways that we need to understand and verify." The revelation about her father hit Sarah like a physical blow. Miguel Martinez had always seemed like an ordinary government worker, someone who dealt with paperwork and bureaucracy rather than classified operations and national security matters. The idea that he had been involved in ongoing classified activities that somehow extended to her was almost impossible to process. "What kind of operation?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the emotional turmoil she was experiencing. "My father died 12 years ago. I don't understand how anything he was involved in could still be relevant, or how it could possibly involve me." Agent Thompson consulted his folder before responding, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Your father was part of a deep cover operation that involved placing assets in various civilian positions throughout the United States. These assets were tasked with monitoring and reporting on activities that could pose threats to national security. The operation was so classified that many of the assets themselves didn't fully understand the scope of their involvement." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to reconcile this information with her memories of her father. Miguel had indeed been away from home frequently, and there had been phone calls at odd hours that he would take in private. She had always assumed these were related to his work schedule and nothing more significant, but now she was beginning to see these patterns in a completely different light. "The emblem in your file," Agent Rodriguez continued, "indicates that you have inherited certain clearances and protections that were originally granted to your father. This is not uncommon in deep cover operations, where family members may need to be protected or monitored to ensure operational security." The concept of inheriting security clearances was foreign to Sarah, but she was beginning to understand that her father's work had created a legacy that extended far beyond his death. The fact that she had been unaware of this inheritance for 12 years suggested that the operation had been sophisticated enough to remain completely hidden from her normal life. "What does this mean for me now?" Sarah asked, the practical implications of the situation beginning to sink in. "I've been living my life normally, working as a social worker, paying my bills, dealing with ordinary problems. I had no idea that I was connected to any kind of classified operation." Agent Thompson's expression softened slightly as he recognized the overwhelming nature of what Sarah was learning. In most cases, inherited clearances remain dormant unless specific circumstances arise that trigger them. Your appearance at the courthouse today, combined with the routine ID check, happened to intersect with ongoing security protocols that flagged your identity for immediate attention. Sarah thought about the chain of events that had brought her to this moment. If she had been able to pay her parking tickets on time, if she hadn't lost her job, if she had chosen to contest the tickets through the mail instead of appearing in person, none of this would have happened. The random nature of how her hidden connection to classified operations had been discovered was both frightening and fascinating. "There's something else we need to discuss," Agent Rodriguez said, his tone becoming more serious. "The operation your father was involved in has recently become active again due to emerging threats. Your clearance level means that you may need to be briefed on certain aspects of this operation, both for your own security and to ensure that you don't inadvertently compromise ongoing activities." The idea that she might need to become actively involved in whatever classified operation her father had participated in was overwhelming. Sarah had built her life around helping families and children through social work, activities that seemed completely disconnected from the world of national security and classified operations that she was now being drawn into. "I need to understand something," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger as she processed the information. "You keep saying that I'm not in trouble, but it sounds like my life is about to change dramatically. Am I going to have a choice in how involved I become in this operation?" Agent Thompson and Agent Rodriguez exchanged a glance before Thompson responded. "That's exactly what we need to determine through this briefing process. Your level of involvement will depend partly on the current threat assessment and partly on your own willingness to participate. However, I should be honest with you that certain security protocols may need to remain in place regardless of your level of active participation." Sarah realized that her ordinary life had probably ended the moment she handed her driver's license to Officer Johnson at the courthouse security checkpoint. Whatever her father had been involved in decades ago had created obligations and connections that she was only now discovering. The emblem in her file represented a legacy that she had inherited without her knowledge or consent, but which now demanded her attention and understanding. The conference room felt smaller as the weight of these revelations settled over her. Sarah Martinez, who had woken up that morning worried about traffic tickets and court appearances, was now sitting in a federal facility learning about classified operations and inherited security clearances that connected her to a world she had never known existed. Agent Thompson opened a second folder, this one marked with classification stamps that Sarah was beginning to recognize as indicators of extremely sensitive information. The documents inside appeared to be a mixture of operational reports, surveillance photographs, and technical data that painted a picture of her father's activities that was completely foreign to her understanding of who Miguel Martinez had been. Your father's code name was Cardinal, Agent Rodriguez explained as he spread several photographs across the table. He was part of Operation Nightwatch, a long-term surveillance and intelligence-gathering mission that focused on identifying and monitoring potential domestic threats to national security. Sarah studied the photographs with growing amazement. They showed her father in various locations and situations that she had never seen or heard about. In some images, he appeared to be conducting business meetings with people she didn't recognize. In others, he was photographed in cities that she knew he had never mentioned visiting during his frequent business trips. Operation Nightwatch was designed to be a generational program, Agent Thompson continued. The assets placed in civilian positions were expected to maintain their cover for decades, possibly passing their responsibilities to family members when necessary. Your father's sudden death in the car accident disrupted the normal transition process. The mention of her father's death as a disruption to operational planning struck Sarah as coldly bureaucratic, but she was beginning to understand that the world of classified operations operated according to different priorities than ordinary human relationships. Her grief and loss had been complications in a larger security framework that she had been completely unaware of. The car accident, Sarah said quietly, a terrible suspicion forming in her mind. Was it really an accident? The question hung in the air like a physical presence, and she could see from the agent's expressions that her intuition had touched on something significant. Agent Rodriguez hesitated before responding, clearly weighing how much information to share. The accident was investigated thoroughly by multiple agencies. While we found no evidence of foul play, the timing was certainly unfortunate from an operational standpoint. Your father was in the process of transitioning certain responsibilities, and his death left some aspects of his mission incomplete. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that even her father's death had been viewed through the lens of operational security and mission continuity. The grief that had shaped her teenage years and influenced many of her life decisions had been, from the government's perspective, primarily a security concern that needed to be managed and contained. What were these responsibilities that he was supposed to transition? Sarah asked, though she was beginning to suspect that she already knew the answer. The inheritance of security clearances that she had learned about was apparently just the beginning of a much larger legacy that her father had intended to pass down to. Her agent Thompson consulted his documents before responding. Your father was monitoring several individuals and organizations in your geographic area that were suspected of having connections to foreign intelligence services. Some of these monitoring operations have continued through other assets, but certain aspects of his work were unique to his position and relationships. The idea that her father had been conducting surveillance operations in their own community was deeply unsettling. Sarah tried to think back to their family's social interactions, wondering which of their neighbors, friends, or community members had been subjects of her father's classified work. The possibility that people she had grown up with
might have been under investigation added another
layer of surreal complexity to the situation. Operation Nightwatch has recently identified new threats that are connected to some of the same networks that your father was monitoring, Agent Rodriguez explained. Your inherited clearances and your position in the community make you potentially valuable for continuing certain aspects of his work. Sarah felt a surge of anger at the assumption that she would simply step into her father's role without question or consideration of her own life and choices. I didn't choose this, she said firmly. I built my own life, my own career, my own identity. I can't just become a spy because my father was involved in classified operations. We understand your reluctance, Agent Thompson replied diplomatically, However, I need to make you aware of certain realities. Your connection to Operation Nightwatch means that you are already part of this world, whether you choose to participate actively or not. Your security and the security of the operation may depend on your willingness to cooperate with our briefings and protocols. The implicit threat in Agent Thompson's words was clear, even though it was delivered in professional and respectful language. Sarah was being told that her normal life was no longer entirely her own, that her father's classified legacy had created obligations and vulnerabilities that she couldn't simply walk away from. What exactly would cooperation involve? Sarah asked, recognizing that she needed to understand the full scope of what was being asked of her before she could make any decisions about her level of involvement. Agent Rodriguez opened a third folder, this one containing what appeared to be operational plans and mission briefings. At a minimum, we would need you to undergo security training and receive regular briefings about potential threats in your area. You would also need to report any unusual contacts or approaches from individuals who might be attempting to gather information about your father's former activities. Sarah realized that the agents were describing a life of constant vigilance and suspicion, where every interaction would need to be evaluated for potential security implications. The trust and openness that had characterized her work as a social worker would become dangerous luxuries that she could no longer afford. There's more, Agent Thompson added, his expression becoming more serious. Some of the individuals that your father was monitoring have recently become active again. We have reason to believe that they may attempt to make contact with you, either to gather information about what you know, or to use you as leverage against ongoing operations. The revelation that she might be a target for foreign intelligence operatives was terrifying, but it also clarified the stakes involved in her decision about cooperation with Operation Nightwatch. Her safety and the safety of the broader operation were apparently interconnected in ways that left her with very limited options. Sarah looked around the secure conference room, realizing that her life had been permanently altered by events that began long before she was born. Her father's decision to participate in Operation Nightwatch had created a legacy that was now defining her future, regardless of her own preferences or plans. I need time to process all of this, Sarah said finally. This morning I was worried about paying traffic tickets, and now you're telling me that I'm part of a classified operation that involves foreign intelligence threats. I can't make decisions about my entire future in one afternoon. Agent Thompson nodded understandingly. We recognize that this is overwhelming, and we're prepared to give you the time you need to make informed decisions. However, for your own security, we'll need to implement certain protective measures immediately while you consider your options. The protective measures that Agent Thompson described turned out to be far more comprehensive than Sarah had anticipated. Within hours of her briefing at the federal facility, her entire living situation was being evaluated and modified by security specialists who approached her ordinary apartment with the thoroughness of military planners, preparing for a siege. Sarah watched in amazement as technicians installed sophisticated security systems in her home, equipment that looked nothing like the simple alarm systems that ordinary citizens might use to protect their belongings. Motion sensors, communication jammers, and monitoring devices were discreetly placed throughout her apartment, transforming her personal space into something resembling a safe house. These measures are temporary, Agent Rodriguez assured her, as the installation team worked efficiently to complete their modifications. Once you've had time to consider your options and we've assessed the current threat level, we can scale back the security presence accordingly. But Sarah was beginning to suspect that nothing about her situation was likely to be truly temporary. The infrastructure being installed in her home suggested preparations for a long-term security commitment that went far beyond a brief, protective period while she made decisions about her involvement in Operation Nightwatch. Her sister Maria arrived that evening, having driven from the neighboring city where she worked as a paralegal. Maria's legal training had prepared her to understand the seriousness of classified operations and national security matters. But even she seemed overwhelmed by the scope of what Sarah was describing about their father's hidden life and its implications for the present. I remember Dad being secretive about his work, Maria said as they sat in Sarah's kitchen, speaking in hushed tones despite the agent's assurance that the apartment was secure. But I always thought it was just boring government paperwork. I never imagined he was involved in anything like espionage or surveillance operations. Sarah noticed that Maria kept glancing around the apartment, obviously uncomfortable with the knowledge that their conversation was likely being monitored by the same government agencies that had just revealed their father's classified legacy. The sisters had always been close, but the weight of classified information was creating new barriers between them that neither knew how to navigate. The strangest part is that I keep thinking back to moments from our childhood that suddenly make sense, Sarah confided. Remember how Dad would sometimes get phone calls in the middle of the night? Or how he would disappear for weeks at a time without really explaining where he was going? I thought he was just a workaholic, but now I wonder if everything about our family life was shaped by his classified activities. Maria nodded slowly, her legal training helping her to understand the implications of what they were discussing. If Dad was involved in long-term surveillance operations, then every aspect of our upbringing was probably influenced by operational security considerations. Our schools, our friends, our social activities, even where we lived might have been chosen partly for strategic reasons. The realization that their entire childhood might have been orchestrated around their father's classified work was deeply unsettling. Sarah had always treasured her memories of family life, but now she was forced to view those same experiences through the lens of operational planning and security protocols. Agent Thompson returned the next morning with new information that changed the urgency of Sarah's situation. Intelligence gathered overnight had revealed that foreign operatives were indeed making inquiries about Miguel Martinez's family, confirming the agent's earlier warnings about potential threats to Sarah's security. We've intercepted communications, indicating that hostile intelligence services are aware of your father's former role in Operation Nightwatch, Agent Thompson explained as he spread new documents across Sarah's dining room table. They're actively seeking information about any family members who might have inherited his clearances or knowledge. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that the theoretical threats the agents had described were now immediate and concrete dangers. The decision about her level of cooperation with Operation Nightwatch was no longer an abstract choice about her future, but an urgent matter of personal survival. What kind of inquiries are they making? Sarah asked, trying to maintain her composure despite the fear that was building inside her. The idea that foreign spies were actively investigating her life was terrifying in ways that she couldn't fully process. Agent Rodriguez consulted his tablet before responding. They're using standard intelligence gathering techniques, social media monitoring, employment records, financial transactions, and contact with people in your social and professional networks. They're building a comprehensive profile of your activities and relationships. The thought that strangers were analyzing every aspect of her life, from her social media posts to her grocery purchases, made Sarah feel violated in a way that went beyond ordinary privacy concerns. Her entire existence was being studied and evaluated by people who might wish her harm, people whose motivations and capabilities she couldn't understand. We've also identified at least 2 individuals who have made contact with people in your workplace, Agent Thompson added. They're posing as researchers conducting surveys about social services, but their questions are designed to gather information about your work schedule, your relationships with colleagues, and your personal habits. Sarah realized that her job at the Social Services Office had not only been affected by budget cuts, but was now also compromised by national security concerns. The children and families she worked with could potentially be put at risk if foreign operatives attempted to use her professional relationships to gather intelligence. I can't continue working with vulnerable families if my presence puts them in danger, Sarah said, the full implications of her situation finally becoming clear. These people trust me to help them, not to bring foreign intelligence threats into their lives. Agent Rodriguez nodded gravely. Your concern for your clients shows integrity, but it also demonstrates why we need your cooperation. The threats we're dealing with don't recognize boundaries between professional and personal relationships. Everyone in your life becomes a potential target or asset. Sarah felt trapped between impossible choices. Cooperating with Operation Nightwatch would mean abandoning the social work career that had given her life meaning and purpose. But refusing to cooperate might put innocent people at risk while also compromising her own safety. There's one more thing you need to know, Agent Thompson said, his expression becoming even more serious. The foreign operatives who are investigating you aren't just gathering intelligence. Recent intercepts suggest that they're planning some kind of direct approach, possibly an attempted recruitment or kidnapping. The word kidnapping hit Sarah like a physical blow, making the abstract threat suddenly concrete and immediate. She was no longer dealing with theoretical security concerns, but with people who might attempt to physically harm her to achieve their intelligence objectives. Maria reached across the table and took Sarah's hand, both sisters recognizing that their family's connection to classified operations had created dangers that extended far beyond anything they had imagined possible. The protective measures in the apartment suddenly seemed inadequate against the level of threat that was being described. "What are my options?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the fear and uncertainty she was feeling. "It sounds like my normal life is over regardless of what I decide about cooperating with your operation." Agent Thompson's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I won't lie to you, Ms. Martinez. Your life has changed permanently, but you do have choices about how you respond to that change, and we're committed to supporting whatever decision you make about your level of involvement." 3 days after her world had been turned upside down at the courthouse, Sarah sat in the same secure conference room where she had first learned about her father's classified legacy. The decision she was about to make would determine not only her own future but potentially the safety of countless others who were connected to Operation Nightwatch and the ongoing threats it was designed to counter. Agent Thompson and Agent Rodriguez had presented her with 3 options, each carrying its own risks and obligations. She could enter witness protection and live under a new identity, completely severing all connections to her past life, but also abandoning any possibility of continuing her father's work. She could accept minimal involvement, receiving regular security briefings and following basic protection protocols while attempting to maintain some semblance of her normal life. Or she could choose full operational involvement, undergoing extensive training and becoming an active asset in the continuation of Operation Nightwatch. "I've spent the last 3 days thinking about my father and the choices he made," Sarah began, her voice clear and determined. "I've realized that he wasn't just protecting national security. He was protecting our community, our neighbors, and people like the families I work with every day. That's a legacy I can't walk away from." Agent Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression showing both respect and concern for what Sarah's decision might mean for her personal safety. "Are you saying you want to accept full operational involvement?" "Because I need to be clear about what that entails. Your life will never be the same, and the risks are significant." Sarah nodded, having already considered the implications thoroughly. "I understand the risks, but I also understand that the threats you've described aren't going away whether I participate or not. At least this way I can help protect other people instead of just hiding from the danger." Agent Thompson opened a new folder, this one containing training schedules and operational protocols that would govern Sarah's transformation from social worker to intelligence asset. "The training process will take several months, and during that time you'll need to maintain your identity while gradually transitioning away from your current job responsibilities, the practical aspects of becoming a spy while maintaining the appearance of an ordinary citizen were complex beyond anything Sarah had imagined. She would need to learn surveillance techniques, communication protocols, self-defense skills, and psychological manipulation methods while continuing to appear to be the same person her friends and colleagues had always known. "Your first assignment will actually build on your existing professional skills," Agent Rodriguez explained, spreading operational documents across the table. "We need someone to monitor several families in the social services system who have been flagged for potential connections to the same networks. Your father was investigating." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she realized that her new role would allow her to continue helping vulnerable families, even though she would now be doing so with hidden motives and classified objectives. The ethical implications of using her social work skills for intelligence gathering were troubling, but she recognized that the alternative might be allowing dangerous threats to go undetected. "Foreign operatives who have been investigating you are part of a larger network that has been using refugee families and social services as cover for their activities," Agent Thompson continued. "Your position gives you natural access to these communities without raising suspicion." Over the following weeks, Sarah's transformation began in earnest. Her days were split between her regular social work duties and intensive training sessions at various secure facilities around the region. She learned to detect surveillance, conduct counter-surveillance, and recognized the subtle signs that might indicate foreign intelligence activities within the communities she served. The training was physically and emotionally demanding, requiring her to develop skills that were completely foreign to her previous experience. Learning to identify potential threats among the families she was trying to help created internal conflicts that she struggled to resolve. But her trainers assured her that protecting these communities from exploitation by foreign operatives was ultimately an extension of her social work mission. Agent Martinez, a new handler who had been assigned to oversee Sarah's transition, had a background similar to her father's and understood the challenges of maintaining deep cover while building genuine relationships in the community. Your father's greatest strength was his ability to care genuinely about the people he was protecting, while never losing sight of the larger threats he was monitoring, Martinez explained during one of their training sessions. 3 months into her new role, Sarah made her first significant operational contribution. She identified a pattern of unusual behavior among several refugee families that suggested they were being manipulated by outside forces. Her report led to the discovery of a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been using social services as a front for gathering information about military installations in the region. The success of her first operation validated her decision to accept full involvement in Operation Nightwatch, but it also made the dangers of her new life more real and immediate. The foreign operatives who had been identified were still at large, and their awareness that their operation had been compromised made them potentially more dangerous to anyone they suspected of interfering with their activities. Sarah's personal relationships had inevitably suffered as she struggled to maintain friendships and family connections while hiding the truth about her new life. Maria remained supportive but concerned, recognizing that her sister was changing in ways that went beyond the obvious security precautions that now governed her daily routine. "Sometimes I look at you and see Dad," Maria confided during one of their carefully scheduled visits. "You have the same watchful expression he used to get, like you're always evaluating everyone around you for potential threats." The observation was accurate and troubling. Sarah had noticed the same change in herself. The way her social work training in reading people and situations had been enhanced and redirected toward identifying security threats, rather than simply understanding human needs and motivations. But, despite the personal costs and the ongoing dangers, Sarah had found a sense of purpose in her new role that validated her decision to honor her father's legacy. She was protecting the same communities she had always served, but now she was doing so at a level that addressed threats her previous work had never been equipped to handle. Standing in her transformed apartment one evening, looking out at the neighborhood where she had built her life, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. A simple traffic court appearance had revealed a hidden world that had always existed parallel to her ordinary life, a world that her father had navigated alone for decades. Now she was part of that world, carrying forward a mission that was larger than herself, but grounded in the same commitment to protecting others that had originally drawn her to social work. The emblem that had appeared in her file that day at the courthouse had represented not just her father's classified legacy, but her own destiny as someone who would stand watch over her community in ways that most people would never know or understand. Sarah Martinez had found her true calling, even though it was nothing like the life she had planned.